Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video we're going to look at how we can ensure that our code actually works and handles all the necessary scenarios. So before we actually dive straight into writing our unit test, let's briefly discuss some of the test cases that we want to cover. So if you just go into our JSON mapper, you'll see here that we actually want to unit test this object that we have here. So what's the goals of our unit test? Well, we want to make sure that this actually decodes properly and throws any errors that we expect as well. And also as well, if we pass in a file that doesn't exist, we actually want it to throw this mapping error as well. So looking at our project, we actually don't have any test targets set up. So if you go into your project and click on here, you'll see that you don't actually have a test target set up at all. So what we're going to do is actually set this up first of all now. So if you just hit plus here, you should get the option to actually see all the template targets that you can now add. Now if you just scroll down, you should see that there's actually something here called a unit testing bundle. Now you don't just have to do it from here. If you wanted to as well, you could actually go File, New, and then Target, and you'll also get the same option as well. So make sure you're on iOS, and then we'll choose Unit Testing Bundle. So if you hit Next, you'll now get an auto-generated name for your test. Now I'm just going to leave it like this, and you should hit Finish as well, because we want it to be in Swift. So you want to hit Next. Cool. And then that should be done for us. So now we should have a unit testing target here. And what that will do is actually create a new folder for us to actually place our unit test within. Cool. So now what we're going to need to do is actually add our file for where we want to keep our unit test, because by default Xcode actually gives you a template file automatically. Now we don't actually want to use this because it doesn't relate to anything that we're trying to use. So let's create a new folder in here, go a new group, and we'll just call it mapper. And then within this folder, we'll just create a new Swift file called JSON mapper test. Cool. And one thing to make sure when you create that new Swift file is that the target that's selected is your unit testing target and not your main project target. I'll show you in this video how we can actually import everything from our first target here into our new target that we just created. So the first thing we want to do is actually import the XCTest framework, like so. And then now we want to write our class for holding all of our unit tests. So we're just going to say class and then JSON mapper test. And it's going to subclass XCTestCase. Cool. Sweet. Now it might take a while for Xcode to show up, but what should happen is you should see like a little play button here eventually, but it might just take a second for it to actually pick up that you've now got a unit testing file here. So what I'm going to do is actually just write the functions that we're going to use to actually test what we want within our mapper file. So whenever you actually write in unit test, what you actually want to do is make sure that your tests start off with the test keyword. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break each one of them down. So now we've actually added in our test, and because we started off with the word test for our function, you'll see that we actually have these play buttons here where we can actually run our unit tests. So what I like to do when I'm actually writing unit tests is I like to, obviously you need to make sure you have test here, but I like to describe what that test is meant to be doing. So for example, we actually want to write a unit test for when our JSON is successfully decoded. So that's why I've called it test with valid JSON successfully decodes. And then we've got two more here. So test with missing file error thrown, and then test with an invalid JSON error thrown. So each one of my tests are actually quite descriptive in terms of what it is I'm trying to unit test. So now that we've done that, we can actually delete this file because we don't need it no more. Cool. And we only need this one file here, like so. Cool. So in order to actually run your unit test, there's actually a few ways to do this. So you could either go to product. So you could either go to product and then test, or you could hit command and then U on your keyboard like it says on a shortcut there. And also as well, you could hit this here to actually run all the tests within this class, or click on one test individually to run it. So if you just hit run on this now, So what's going to happen is that Xcode is going to actually run the test using our simulator. And you can see here that all of our tests passes because there's actually nothing within the functions to make it fail. But what we do want to do is we actually do want to make this fail. Now we can easily do this by using something called an XCT fail. So the reason why you actually want to do this initially and you want your test to fail is so you can actually work backwards when writing unit tests. So you actually want your test to fail first and then fix it. So you're working in reverse order. So let's just go into each one of our unit tests and just make them fail. So we didn't put a message in any of the XCT fails, but if we run this now, you should see that Xcode picks up and tells you that they've all failed. And you can see that when they do fail, we actually get a nice little summary panel automatically opened up for us that tells us which ones have failed. Sweet. So the first test that we're going to tackle is our JSON mapper successfully decoding. So in order to actually get our mapper within this unit test, because if I just start typing JSON mapper, you'll see that it doesn't exist. So what we actually need to do is import our SwiftUI project, iOS project target into this unit test. Now we can do that by just simply saying here @testable, and then we just import our target like so. Sweet. So whatever your target is called in the target here, that's what you have to write when you're importing it in there like so. Cool. So now we actually have access to our JSON mapper file. So the first test that we want to do is want to make sure that when we pass in a valid file to our JSON mapper, it doesn't throw an error. And we can do this by using an XCTAssert with no throw. So let's do that now. So now we have our XCT no assert no throw, and we're basically using our static JSON mapper to decode the file that we have within our project. So we're literally just decoding this file here and then mapping it to our model. And then we have a message here that says that it should show this error message if this test doesn't pass. Now, if you want to learn more about asserting things, I'd highly recommend you watch my previous video where I actually break down what unit testing is. So now, let's actually just run this and see what happens with this test. Cool. So as you can see, this test actually failed, and the reason why it failed is because we actually passed in the wrong type to actually decode it to. So we don't want this to be user detail response. We actually want this to be user's response. So let's just rerun that. Cool. And now the test passed. So we're not actually done here because we need to actually make sure that all the properties within our JSON file match what we expect. So let's just open up our JSON file here. And as you can see, this is the JSON object that we actually want to basically test. So we want to ensure that every single one of these properties matches what we're expecting, including like the support URL and whatnot. So I'm going to start off by just literally just typing out like the first bits, and then we'll tackle it bit by bit. So if we go back into our tests, the first thing that we want to tackle within here is we want to make sure that our user response is not nil. So let's do that now. So what we do is we use a try to get our user's response and put that inside of a constant. So what we do is we use our try to actually try to decode our static JSON file, and we put that inside of a constant, and then we just simply verify if that constant is nil or not. So if this is nil, then what's going to happen is that it should fail by using this XCT, because this XCTAssert is making sure that it's not nil. So let's just run this test again. And you can see that our test is still succeeding. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to actually ensure that the objects, if we go back into our JSON, so the properties that we have here are actually all the same in terms of when they get decoded. So just to make life a bit easier, what I'm actually going to do is just put this side by side with our unit test. So let's go into our unit test. Sweet. And then we can just simply see what it is that we need to do. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So now what we want to do is we actually want to run this again. We're saying that the value inside of this match this here, and if it does, then sweet. If it doesn't, then we'll display this message. So if you actually look at our JSON, you can see how we're just basically mapping it to see if they're the same. So that's all we're doing. Now you might see this failed here, and it's not actually failing. What's just going on is that Xcode is just being a bit doo-doo. So the only thing that matters when you're running your test is the little tick here. So whether it's passed or failed. So let's run this again and see what happens. Cool. And you can see that our test still succeeds, so everything's good. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to actually decode and essentially just check all the properties within our data to make sure that they're all correct. So we'll tackle this section by section. So let's just do the first section together, and then I'll type out the other sections afterwards. So as you can see here, we're actually accessing the data using the subscripting by accessing the first value at index 0, and then we're simply just matching each one of the properties to the JSON. So you can see here the ID, email, first name, last name, and the avatar to make sure that they're all correct. So let's just run this. And you can see that our test still passes. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to literally fill this out for the rest of them, because I'm pretty sure you don't want to watch me do that, because it'll take a long time. And then once I finish doing that, we'll get back to analyzing it all. Now we've added in all of our objects within our array that we want to unit test, and as well as the support URL at the bottom here. So a lot of these are actually using XCTAssertEquals. Now one thing that I didn't cover was that we actually also check the number of items within our array also matches. So we're basically just making sure that everything is the same of what we expect. Cool. So if we run this now, let's just see what happens. And we get a tick. So now we're able to confidently confirm that our unit test here and the code we wrote for decoding actually works fine. So that's all good. So let's move on to our next test, and the next test that we want to test was if our file was missing, was an error thrown. Now what I'm going to do is actually unit test this with a file name that doesn't exist, so an empty string. So I'm going to use the same XCT assert throws error to see if it throws an error successfully. So let's add this in and then we'll break it down. Cool. So let's run this again. Sweet. And now our test passes. Now we're not done by just doing this, because although we do know an error is thrown, we need to make sure that it's the right error that we want, because if you go into our decode function, you'll see that we throw our own custom error, and you can also possibly get a system error as well. We want to make sure that we get our custom error. So let's actually add some more code to check to see if it's the error that we expect. So in order for us to do this, we're actually going to use a do catch, and we're going to essentially cast the error that we get back and then validate it by using an XCTAssert as well. So let's type this one out together. So we're going to say do and then catch. So within our do, we're just going to do an underscore because we don't need to hold this value, and we're going to say try and then static JSON mapper dot decode empty file users response dot self, like so. Cool. And then within our catch, this is where we want to convert our error and cast it. So we're going to say guard let mapping error is equal to error as static JSON mapper dot mapping error, and then we're going to say or else return, and then we also want it to run an XCT fail to say that this is the wrong mapping error. Cool. And then if it does pass, then what we're going to do here is an XCTAssertEqual, and then we're going to compare our mapping error to our static JSON mapper mapping error dot fails get content, and then we're just going to say this should be a failed to get contents error. Cool. So we're running a do catch here, and then I fully expect this to fall into the catch block, and then we're going to try and cast the error to the type that we want. Now if it doesn't cast it, then we're going to just run an XCT fail. If it does cast it, then what we're going to do is carry on, and then we're going to do a comparison between this and our custom error that we define within our static JSON mapper. So let's just run this and see what happens. And as you can see, we've now got a failure. So this unit test actually failed and it didn't behave as we expected. So what we need to do now is we need to figure out where the issue is. So first thing we want to do is we want to see why when we try to throw that mapping error, does it not hit this throw line here. So let's just put a breakpoint on this line here, and then we're going to step through to see what happens if it hits this point. So we'll go back to our unit test and we'll just go run it. And then when you're debugging, we're able to hit this breakpoint. So when you're debugging, you can actually step into a function or step out of it. But what we want to do is we want to step over it. So let's step over this line. And on this line, I'm expecting it. Now on this line, it shouldn't actually be hitting this line at all because there actually isn't a file, so there's no contents to get. So what should be happening is that we should actually, before we even get here, automatically go within our guard block here. So if I actually carry this on, you'll see that it continues onto the decoder, which is wrong. So what should happen is it should hit this throw. So what we essentially need to do is in our guard statement, we also need to make sure that the file name is not empty. So let's go above our path here. And then we're just going to say file dot is empty. So we want to say not empty. Cool. So if the file name is not empty, then we want to carry on, or else it will throw that error. So let's actually just step out of this. And it's going to fail, which is fine. But now let's actually just go back into our test, or we could actually just run it from here. And now it's hit this line. So if we just step over, you should see that automatically, because our file is empty, it failed there. We're now throwing our mapping error. So if we now continue, cool, our test now succeeds. So if we go back into our test, you should see now that this has a tick. So just by writing this test, we were able to actually validate that we did have a tiny small bug within our code, because if we ever got into a situation where we were actually handling missing file names where it's an empty string, we would actually get the wrong type of error and possibly handle the wrong type of journey. So this is the benefits of using unit tests. It helps you catch these, edge cases. Now we've got a test here for when an error is thrown for a file missing. What I want to do as well is I actually want to test to see if we just pass in like a random file that doesn't exist at all with a random name. So for that, we're just going to copy this and then paste it. And then rather than say with missing file, we're just going to say invalid file name. And then I'm just going to just write some random text within here. Cool. And similar to our other example, we should get the same result with this unit test, because it should basically say the file doesn't exist. So we should hit this assert equals and it should be all good. Now it's taken Xcode a while for it to pick up that this is a test. So we just got to wait for it to just realize that we do have a unit test here. But what I will do in the meantime is I may just run the whole class. So you can see here now it's appeared. I can see that both of our tests now pass. So now we can confidently ensure that if we pass in an invalid file name and a missing file name, then we'll actually always get the right error we expect. So we move on to our final test that we got here. This final test is what we throw when we throw an error when we get invalid JSON. So we essentially want to validate that if you pass in a type for our mapper that doesn't match the JSON structure, it should throw a system error from the JSON decoder. So first thing we want to do is actually make sure that we're throwing an error. So let's do this now. Cool. So what we've done here is we're using the user static data, and we're using the wrong type here because we're actually using a user detail response. So what should happen is that this test should pass. Cool. So now this test passed because the user static JSON is not the same as the user detail response, so it should always fail. Cool. So the next thing we want to do now is we want to validate and make sure that the error that we get back is not the mapping error. So let's just go back here, and then we need to write some code to basically validate that it's not a mapping error. So we're going to say do catch, and then we're just going to say underscore again try static JSON mapper, and then we're just going to decode the user's static data, and then the type for us is going to be user detail response because we want it to fail. And then within our catch statement, we want to check to see if the error is a mapping error from the state to JSON mapper. Then we're going to just fail it. So for our type here as well, we need to make sure that we say .self, like so. Cool. So by us writing the logic like this, we're actually ensuring that in the future, if we ever add any more mapping errors, this unit test will automatically cover this for us. So because we're not actually asserting anything after this, if nothing goes wrong here, so if we don't hit our XCT fail, this test will actually technically pass. So this is just another example of where you don't have to always use XCTAssert to make sure that your test pass. We're actually going to throw a failure here if we get an error that is a static JSON mapper. So let's actually run the test in all of our classes, and rather than having to scroll all the way to the top to do this, we can simply just run either all the tests in our unit test target here, or all the tests specifically within a test class. So I'm just going to run everything, and it should launch a simulator, and then it should run a test, and boom, all our tests have passed. So now we've handled our first set of errors for mapping a decoder, and also found a possible edge case when the file name was missing. So in our next video, we're actually going to look at how we can unit test our validator and ensure that it handles the right types of validation and throws the right types of errors. So if you enjoyed this video, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you in a bit. Deuces.